Hey, I'm Becca with the Happy Ever Crafter, and in this video I'm going to show you how to create a watercolor monogram with floral doodles that looks like this. These make such good gifts. I've given so many of them to friends, and I think that your friends and family will like them too. So let's jump right in. Okay, so first things first with tools for this video. The first most important thing you're going to need obviously is watercolor paint. These are Ecoline watercolor paints. They're liquid watercolor, so they're just like a runnier, kind of vibrant version of watercolor paint. You can also use tubed watercolor paints, the ones you put in a palette. Those are totally fine as well. As far as colors, this is going to be totally up to you. I'm going to be doing a rainbow style, so I've got all the colors of the rainbow in my Ecoline palette here, but again, you can use absolutely whatever you want. You can do 1 color, 2 colors, 10 colors, whatever works for you. Next, you're also going to need some watercolor brushes. These are Princeton Snap brushes. You'll also see them in different colors, but these are just the ones I had kicking around. I have a size 16 and a size 10. You can use any size you want. It really doesn't matter. All we're going to be doing is kind of painting some blotches, so whatever you have kicking around. I have a cup of water. I have painter's tape. I have an eraser. This is optional. The eraser is totally optional, but you'll see why I have it at the end. I have micron pens. These are size 0.3 and 0.5. You can use whatever size you want. Doesn't have to be micron pens, any black fine liner pens, but micron is great because it doesn't run when it's touched with water. And I have paper towel. And then I also have cold press watercolor paper. Now this is one that I really recommend. It's just Strathmore watercolor paper. The important part is that you're picking cold press because it has a bit more grit to it and it's gonna hold more water than hot press would. So this is a really good option in terms of quality for price, but I'm actually going to be using Arches, which is quite a bit more expensive. The reason I'm using Arches is because I'm doing a really nice final gift for a friend, and I want it to be just on a more high quality paper, but you'll find that Arches is quite expensive. So if you can get it, great. If not, this Strathmore watercolor paper is also great, or any other cold press watercolor paper. Then an important part to talk about is the masking fluid. This is going to be really important for this video. There's a lot of different kinds of masking fluid, and basically what it does is you put it around the edge of whatever you don't want to color in, and it sort of acts as a barrier, and it will keep the paper clean underneath, and then you pull it off after and it saves whatever you're trying not to color on. So there's a couple different options. There are just like jugs of it, like this one. This is Grumbacher, and this one's actually orange, which is kind of cool because when you put it on the paper, you can see where it is. It's not like white or translucent. It's pretty obvious where you've put the masking fluid. The problem I find with using jugs or little jars like this one is that you have to use a brush in it, and usually using brushes with masking fluid kind of ruins the brush. So I don't necessarily love using this. Then you have this one. It's called a fine line masking fluid pen, and it's got like a pin tip on it, and so you can just disperse it really carefully out that small tip. This one I find tends to go on pretty thick, and sometimes it's hard to pull off the paper but like until it's perfectly dry, and it takes a little longer to dry, so I'm not going to use this one either. And my favorite is this Molotow art masking liquid pump marker. I'll link to all these things down below so you can grab them, but this one is really great because obviously it's a marker and it's really easy to use, and I find it doesn't tear up your paper, it doesn't take too long to dry. It's just like a really good option for what we're doing. So this is what I'm going to be using, but if you have any of these other options and you don't have the pen option, these are all great. I also have a heat gun. This is just an optional piece that you can use to dry things faster if you're working sort of quickly, which I will be for this tutorial, but it's totally optional. This is just a Recollections heat gun from Michaels. And then lastly, and most importantly, you need to have your cutout of your letter. So what I've done here is I just printed out this letter on my computer, and then I put it on cardstock and I cut it out. So this is a little bit thicker. It doesn't have to be. You could just use normal printer paper, and as long as you have something that you can use for the outline of your letter, you could also just draw it onto your page, whatever works for you. So that's pretty much it for supplies. Now let's jump right in. Okay, so the first step in this process is going to be to tape down or hold down your letter and you do your masking fluid outline. So I'm going to just use some of this painter's tape and really quickly tape down my letter on some of the edges. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's just going to kind of hold it in place while we put the masking fluid around it. Okay, and then place your letter wherever you want it to go on the page. I'm just going to sort of center this one. If you're a perfectionist, you can measure it, but I've never been a perfectionist, so here we are. All right, and then once you have your letter in place, you're just gonna take your masking fluid, whether it's the pen or a brush or whatever you're using. If you're using the pen, make sure you shake it up nicely. And then you're just gonna go around the edges of your letter. I like to make this a little bit thicker than just one pass at it, because you'll find when you're starting to get a little bit loose with your watercolor painting that you'll run over the edges a little tiny bit. So just make it a little bit thicker than you feel like you need to. Okay, then once your masking fluid is on there, you can peel off your letter. If it's still wet, I would do it carefully, but it's not a huge deal. So then you have the outline of your letter. And if you need to, if you find any places that you need to touch up, just go ahead and do that now. But this looks pretty good to me. So we're done with the masking fluid layer. And now you're gonna wanna let it dry until it's perfectly dry on the page before we start adding water. So while I wait for this to dry, I'm gonna start setting up my colors. So again, I'm using Ecoline liquid watercolors, and I've got all the colors of the rainbow. So I'm just gonna take the tops off of these. One thing I'll say is if you're using liquid watercolor, just be careful when you're opening them, especially if you have a white desk. I have spilled a whole one on my desk before, and it's not a fun experience. Then I'll grab my brushes and my water and my paper towel. And as soon as this masking fluid is dry, I'm ready to paint. Okay, so my masking fluid is dry. I'm gonna just jump in and start painting now. The one thing I'm gonna say is that I'm gonna move pretty quickly through what I'm doing here because I actually have a full course on painting watercolors. So if you've never done color mixing or wet on wet painting techniques, and if you don't even know what that means, definitely check out showmeyourflorals.com. I'll link to it down below. It's a free course taught by me and another artist, Stephanie Fehrenbach, and we walk you through everything you need to know from the ground up with watercolors. So I'm gonna move pretty quickly through this, but essentially all we're doing is just filling up this K with different color swatches and just kind of playing with it and making it until we're happy with it. So all I'm gonna do is dip my brush in the water. Now when you're using liquid watercolors, you don't need it to be super wet, but what I'm doing is I'm gonna start doing some wet on wet technique, which means dropping some water on here, just kind of haphazardly, and then I'm gonna take my paintbrush into my paint and just start dabbing, and it'll fill up wherever you've left any water. So I'm just gonna jump in and start filling up my whole K, and I'm actually gonna do sort of a rainbow pattern. So I'm gonna start up here and work my way down towards the bottom in a rainbow. So you'll notice as I'm doing this that I'm not too concerned if my paint touches my masking fluid. The masking fluid is protecting my paper, so it's gonna give us a nice crisp edge at the end. What you wanna make sure is you just don't go over the masking fluid. If at any point you notice any colors or big puddles that you don't really love the color of, what you can do is just take a piece of your paper towel. So for example, this little spot right here is getting a really big puddle, and the orange and green together are sort of making it look brown. So I'm gonna just dab in a little bit and take off some of that color. What you wanna keep in mind is that you have to do this while it's wet or it won't come out. Okay, I've got a pretty good base layer of what I want this to look like, and you'll notice I leave a little bit of white in between. I find it looks really pretty that way. You don't have to, you can fill it in all the way if you want. And you'll notice that most of the spots that my color is hitting around the edges are filling up the edge. That's gonna give your monogram a really kind of crisp look. So make sure you don't leave too much white spaces around the edge. For now, I'm gonna take my heat gun and I'm gonna dry this, and then we're gonna do another layer to really make things pop. Okay, this is pretty dry and I like most of it. Some of the bleeds are really, really pretty. I love the way that these are all kind of mushing together. And if you've never played with color bleeds, again, make sure you sign up for Show Me Your Florals because we go over that lots. But there's a couple spots in here where I don't actually love the way it turned out. Like this is a pretty harsh line right here. So I'm just gonna add a little bit of color to my brush and smush it around a bit. And you'll notice that it sort of softens it. And I'm actually gonna take a little bit of color here and kind of fill it in. So it's not going to be perfect, but this is just kind of the general idea, to start throwing in a couple more layers of color and just fill things out a little bit. Some of them can be really subtle, like almost just only using water. We'll smush around a little bit of the color a bit and kind of soften things. You barely even have to add any color to your brush. So that first technique that I did, where I added just water and then dabbed the color in it, that technique is called wet on wet watercolor painting. And what I'm doing now is I'm adding dry, or wet on dry. So my bottom layer is dry and now I'm adding wet paint on top of it, and you'll see that it doesn't necessarily bleed together. It sort of does like a really pretty overlap. So that's one of the things we talk a lot about in Show Me Your Florals. And what I'm doing here also is some of these places I'm adding kind of circular shapes, like this blue one I just did and this pretty green one. I'm thinking in my head that these are probably going to be sort of my most accented flowers that I'm going to draw on afterwards. So if you make them sort of in the shape of the flower that you're going to draw, it's going to look really cool. Okay, and then once you're happy with the colors on your page, again, I'm gonna use my heat gun, but you can just let yours dry, walk away for a bit, and then come back. All right, so we're done with painting the flower, but don't take the masking fluid off yet. Not that I've shown you how to do it anyway. Don't take that off yet because now we're gonna draw on the flowers. Now, if you've never drawn or doodled flowers before and you're worried about screwing this up, check out my whole playlist. You can press pause on this video and come back, but check out the playlist of all the different flowers that I've taught how to draw. They each have a free worksheet and you can check that out. Learn how to draw the flower first before you put it on here. I'm gonna do a peony, one of my favorite flowers, and I'm gonna just kind of jump into drawing it on here. So I'm using a micron 0.03 and 0.5. I'm gonna start with the 5 and I'm gonna just start drawing on all of the flowers on here. Don't be afraid to rotate your page too. You wanna kind of look at the way that these blobs of color were laid out on the page and kind of see if any of them inspire you on the shape and the direction of your flower. So for example, this green one to me sort of looks like it's opening this way, so I'm going to draw this peony this way, but I might have a different flower that turns a totally different way depending on the blobs. So just kind of start wherever you want on maybe some of these accent blobs that you drew and just build on that. So you'll notice in some of these spots as I work on this green blob here, I'm trying to follow the outline of it. You don't have to. I just find that if you follow it a little bit and then let away from it a little bit also, it gives it kind of just a little bit of texture and a little bit of, you know, looseness and fun to it. So these kind of edges sort of just naturally look like petals. Okay, I've got my main flowers in. Now I'm gonna start drawing some leaves and then adding all of the details with my 03 pen. Okay, so I'm done drawing my flowers. I'm really happy with the way this looks, and now we get to do the most fun part, which is taking off the masking fluid. So this is where that eraser comes in handy. If you have an eraser, this works really well to pick up the masking fluid. You can also get like an actual pickup tool. It looks like a little rubber square. That works well too, or you can just use your fingers. So you're just gonna start in the corner and start essentially erasing it, just sort of rubbing over top of it. So you can use your eraser, or you can just do this with your finger. So I actually have one of these square rubber pickup tools, so that's what I'm using.
I'm not too concerned if my paint touches my masking fluid. The masking fluid is protecting my paper.
Okay, I am not super impressed with the way that masking fluid worked, to be quite honest. Usually it doesn't have this much of a bleed, but I think it's probably a combination of me using too much water and using the heat gun. So there's a little bit of color bleeding around the edges of my K. Now that probably shouldn't happen to you, and if I was being picky, I would redo this tutorial, but like I said at the beginning, I'm not a perfectionist. You guys understand the idea. What I do want to point out though is that there's a couple things you can do to touch this up a little bit, and one of them is the Mono Sand Eraser. This is a Tombow eraser, and it's gritty, and so what you can do is just kind of go around the edges and act like an eraser. Now it's not going to get off everything, but it's definitely going to make a little bit of an improvement. Essentially what it does is it sort of takes off a layer of the paper. So if you do it too much, it'll get a little bit messy. And it might even put a hole in your paper if you try to go too crazy with it, but it definitely makes quite a bit of an improvement here. So I'm going to do this around the edge of my K. So you can really see how much of a difference that makes around the edges here. It's still not 100% perfect, but it's definitely better than it was, and it's definitely good enough. Okay, so it took a little bit of touching up, and it's not perfect, but I am totally fine with that. I really like the way it turned out. The Tombow Mono Sand Eraser saved my butt in this instance, but hopefully that's not a problem for you and your masking fluid worked totally fine. The other option is if you ever had this problem happen to you and the masking fluid really bleeds, but you don't want to totally redo this, or it's for a client and it has to be really, really perfect, the other option you could do is you can cut it out and stick it on a new piece of watercolor paper. Just make sure that it's taped down really nicely, and if they're going to frame it, it really actually would probably look quite nice with a little bit of a border. Or you can actually take a black marker and do an outline around the edges, or you could even take a white one and do an outline, and it would be really hard to tell that it's covering anything up. So that's pretty good for me. So that's it for this tutorial. But again, if you're interested in watercolors and you like doing this kind of thing, make sure you're signed up for the Show Me Your Florals free watercolor course. It walks you all the way from the very basics up to painting some really beautiful florals, and it's all free. So I'll link to it down below and you can go sign up. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, mistakes and all. It really showed you that I'm not perfect, and that sometimes it requires me to troubleshoot too. But overall, I hope you had fun with it. I'd love to see your work, so tag me on Instagram at @thehappyevercrafter if you do it. Make sure you hit the subscribe button on this channel because I put out 2 new videos like this every single week, and I'll see you in the next one.